Modern video games are seamless interactive experiences responding in real time to the input provided by the user. This is all enabled by a surprisingly simple concept that we'll learn all about in this video. Hello everyone, my name is Mike and you're watching Polymath Unlimited. In this series we are learning the C++ programming language by building our own Sudoku game. In the last episode we learned how to use arrays to represent Sudoku's game board. In this episode we will make our game interactive by setting up the game loop. There are lots of kinds of games out there, from shooters to RTS games to puzzle games and even board games. While all of these games might seem very different at first, they all have one thing in common. They all have a number of steps repeatedly performed in a certain order. This is called a game loop. For most computer and video games, the game loop looks something like this. First, we get input from the user. Second, we update the game state. This could include things like updating scores, moving game objects, and so on. And finally, give output to the user. This could be sound, graphics, text, and so on. By repeating the steps of the game loop over and over, we can make a program that functions as a smooth, seamless interactive experience. The task then is writing code that can execute repeatedly over and over. Luckily, most programming languages, including C++, have some built-in functionality to accomplish just that. We call these loops. I know, the name is very creative. C++ has two main kinds of loops, while loops and for loops. We'll start with while loops and then explain for loops in a moment. A while loop is a loop that repeatedly executes a section of code while some condition is true. To make a while loop in our code, we simply type while in our code file, and then the condition in parentheses, and then the code we want to execute in the loop inside curly braces. The condition is a Boolean value, a value that can have one of two states, true or false. We can hardcode the condition to true or false manually, resulting in a loop that either executes forever or never executes at all, or we can use either a bool variable or an expression as the condition, allowing us to let our program choose when to exit the loop. As an example, this while loop will simply print the statement "I'm looping forever" until we manually close the program. And this while loop will print the statement "I'm looping 10 times" and then exit the loop. Now let's use a while loop to construct our Sudoku program's game loop. We'll start by declaring a Boolean variable called running and initialize this variable to true. Then we'll make a while loop with our variable as the condition. This will loop through our code until running becomes false. Now within our while loop, let's put some comments describing what we want our loop to be doing. Comments are just text that our compiler will ignore, allowing us to make it more obvious what our code is supposed to be doing. Comments are always a good idea, especially in larger programs, since it can be difficult to tell what a piece of code is supposed to do just by looking at it. We can make comments by placing 2 slashes into our code. Then anything that we type on the same line after the 2 slashes will be ignored when our program runs. Here, we'll place the comments in our loop outlining the loop's basic structure. Now we simply need to implement this structure in our code. The first thing we want to do in our game loop is get input from the user. Since we are building a console program, we will be accepting text input. We'll introduce a new variable type called string here. Strings are a type of variable that stores text data. It is possible to use arrays of characters instead of strings, but for most programs, strings are easier to use. Since strings are not a built-in data type in C++, we'll need to include the string library in order to use them. Now that we can use strings, let's declare one called command in our game loop. In order to get text input from the user, we can use cin from the IOStream library. Cin waits for input from the user, and then puts the input given from the user into whatever variable we give it. In this case, we want cin to put the data we got from the user into our command string. Now, if we then output that command string to the console, we have a very simple loop that takes input from the user and then repeats back to the user whatever the user gave it. However, notice that cin stops at the first space it encounters. If we want to have our command be able to have spaces in it, we need to use the getLine function from the string library. Now, even if we typed something that has a space in it, our program will still read the full line we typed as input. Now that we have input from the user, the next thing to do is to decide what to do with that input. In order to do this, we'll need to implement conditional branching in our code. C++ provides built-in support for conditional branching using if statements. These are blocks of code that execute only if some condition is met. Otherwise, the block will be ignored. The syntax for an if statement is identical to a while loop. We simply type if, then our condition in parentheses, and then whatever code we want to be in the if statement inside curly braces. To check to see if our command is equal to some predefined command, exit for example, we simply use the is_equal_to operator. This is simply two equal signs placed next to each other, and will evaluate to true only if the things on both sides of it have the same value. Now, inside our if statement, we'll set running to false. We now have a simple program that gets input from the user, and then exits if our user tells it to. We can add more commands to enable more complex behavior to our program, but we'll worry about that later. The last thing we want to do in our game loop is to give some output to the user. We'll actually move this section to the top of our while loop, since we do want to output to the user first so that the user can see what they're doing before entering commands. Since we're building a Sudoku game, we'll put some code here to display a Sudoku board to the user. We could do this with a bunch of cout statements like we did at the end of the last video, but we can actually use loops to do this much more easily. We'll use for loops for this. For loops are a more advanced type of loop that let us have more control over how our loop executes. To use a for loop, we type for, then some code that we'll get into shortly in parentheses, then the code that we want to run in our for loop in curly braces. In the parentheses where our condition would normally be in our while loop, we instead have three separate sections, separated by semicolons. The first section is a line of code that we want to execute before the loop begins. The most common thing to put here is some variable that we will use to count iterations of the loop. The next section is a condition, which behaves identically to the condition in our while loop. The most common thing to put here is a condition that will make our loop exit when the variable declared in the previous section reaches some threshold value. The last section is a line of code that runs every time the loop finishes. The most common thing to put here is some code that modifies our counter variable. Here, ++i is just shorthand for incrementing I by 1. This is the most common structure for a for loop, but for loops are very flexible and you can get all sorts of complex behavior by exploiting this flexibility. For now, we'll just stick with this though. To display our board, we'll use two for loops, one nested inside the other. One will loop through y values, and the other will loop through x values. Then, inside the second for loop, we will have a single cout statement that prints the board value at the corresponding x and y coordinates. We also want to end the line in the console after we are finished printing all the values in a single line. After we display the board, we'll print some more text to the console, prompting the user to enter a command. Before we end today's video, let's add some code that will let the user modify the board. To do this, we'll add another if statement into our while loop. We'll use the substring method of the string class to check to see if the first three characters of the command string are equal to set. If they are, then we'll use the other characters in the command string to decide which square we want to modify and what value we want to set that square to. Now, our program can accept user input, and then either modify the board or exit the program based on that input. Our program really is starting to at least resemble a game of Sudoku. In the next video, we will make further refinements to our program by adding code that will enforce Sudoku's rules. We will also start making our code modular. This will make it easier to write large programs since we can work on each small piece of our program individually. Until then, feel free to play around with what we have here and see what other kinds of commands you might want to add to your own version of this program. Thank you for watching, happy coding, and I will see you next time.